Sorry for that interruption. Some calls you have to take. Just a couple more remarks on Nagel that you thought were interesting. Someone wrote, likewise, it reminds me of people who might be idolized pre-death, or before their deaths, or for a while after death, and then somewhere in history, popular opinion of their person changes. Like an historical figure who's praised for an act, his or her participation in something at the time, but then is later revealed to have a dark secret or other poor character trait, and then becomes looked down upon by distant future generations. It is certainly a striking part of Nagel's essay that he says that we can do injuries to a dead person. The example he gives is something like this: a famous author who is thought after death to have plagiarized all his work, or he says this is why it's wrong to break a deathbed promise, because it's an injury to the dead person. An interesting aspect of it, I suppose that he kind of has to go that far if he's going to say that somebody can be a bad thing can happen to somebody who doesn't exist anymore. Which is an essential point, I suppose, in establishing that death is bad. And we can certainly think of historical figures who've been reappraised. I guess most controversially, somebody like Christopher Columbus, who has not been lately been very well thought of. Other historical figures who might have been universally admired, who are much more ambivalent. We're much more ambivalent about, but an interesting observation. One reason I'm convinced of this is because why death is bad in one particular part of Nagel's work, where he states, quote, "A man is the subject of good and evil as much because he has hopes which may or may not be fulfilled, or possibilities which may or may not be realized, as because of his capacity to suffer and enjoy." That's an important quote, because if good and evil can happen to you only according to your capacity to suffer and enjoy, then Epicurus is right and Nagel's wrong. If something bad can happen to somebody because something prevents them from experiencing future goods, then maybe Nagel's right and Epicurus is wrong. I don't think death is bad because we are no longer existing, but bad because we are robbed of future opportunities and future experiences that may have been good for us, which Nagel explains. That is basically Nagel's argument. I'm also convinced by Nagel's argument because of the statement that death is a loss. So that's the same thing. Being robbed of future opportunities, future experiences is why death is a loss. Death is a loss since it is a loss of life and thus loss of future possibilities. So it's not the loss of life itself. It's the fact that life is necessary in order to realize the future possibilities. But this is good. This is good work on Nagel. Turning to the last thing we read, Bruckner and Fisher's Why is Death Bad? This is an interesting remark. I'm not totally sure I get it, but the person said in Bruckner and Fisher's Why is Death Bad? They comment that if given the choice to live between 1915 and 1995 or 1925 and 2005, that is quite clear that you'd prefer the second option because you would want your good experiences in the future. That's a rather complicated choice that we're given at the end of Why is Death Bad? Whether you'd want an extra 10 years tacked on to the beginning of your life in the past or an extra 10 years tacked on to your end of your life in the future, they believe that the only rational choice is to want the latter, to want the 10 years in the future. This person challenges that. The authors make an assumption in their statement above, and there is no room to argue against their point. Just why is it so clear that someone would pick 1925 to 2005 over the other timeline? Seems like that is a subjective comment for them to have made. Maybe so. I don't know to think a lot more about it. Very interesting conjecture. But basically, the point that they're making is that it's a deeply rooted part of our rationality. And this goes to their solution, or their proposed solution to the asymmetry problem, that we want our pleasures in the future rather than the past, which is the opposite of where we would want our bads or our sufferings. We'd rather have our sufferings in the past than in the future, while we'd rather have our pleasures in the future than the past. This is what they consider to be just a deeply rooted aspect of our psychology. Like, I'd rather find out that I will have 10 years of life in the future than that I did have 10 years of life in the past. I don't know. Maybe it is subjective. Maybe it's arbitrary. But it's absolutely crucial to their argument, because ultimately, their solution to the asymmetry problem is that we care more about the goods in the future that will be deprived of by our posthumous non-existence, our death, than we care about the goods that we were deprived of by our prenatal non-existence, because they're in the past rather than the future. I hope I got that right. I like to part this example of getting surgery. The example states that after surgery, patients are given a drug to make them forget the painful process. Patient asks the nurse if he had the surgery yet because he can't remember. The nurse responds by saying that she isn't sure if he had the 10-hour painful surgery yesterday or if he is having the surgery tomorrow. The patient says he hopes he had the 10-hour painful surgery yesterday. First, I was confused why the patient would say this, but then I understood that I would think the same way. I think we all would if I was in that situation. If I have to experience bad things in life, I would rather have experienced them in the past instead of worrying or fearing for them in the future. Again, that's totally in line with what they're saying. The point of that example is to say that we consider it very rational to prefer to have our sufferings, our bad things in the past than in the future, even if in the example, the choice is between 10 hours of pain in the past or 1 hour of pain in the future. We prefer 10 hours over 1 hour of pain because it's 10 hours in the past. Very, very important for their point. But ultimately, right, they switch focus to not how we have this temporal bias with regard to bads, but our temporal bias with regard to goods is what ultimately is their solution. The idea of prenatal non-existence and death is something I did not think of before. How on the surface the two are quite the same. That's the point of the Epicurean point, or the Lucretian point about asymmetry, is that these are simply two periods of non-existence, and so we should regard them in the same way. We should give them the same value. And the fact that we don't, again, to an Epicurean, is a signal that we're being irrational. Bruckner and Fisher argue that the two may seem the same on the surface, but looking deeper, they are not. The argument they make does explain more why death is bad. They say that death is taking away the good things we already have had, while prenatal non-existence is taking away the good things in which we could have had if we'd been born earlier. That might need a little adjustment there, but I think it does get across the point that Bruckner and Fisher argue that they argue that prenatal and posthumous non-existence are different, and therefore it is rational to regard them differently, because the fact that one is in the past and one is in the future gives them a different value for us, and that it's not irrational then to regard them differently, to treat them asymmetrically, right? So a solution to the asymmetry problem is a justification of our asymmetrical treatment of these two periods of non-existence. I think an interesting point is when the example on page 218 comes up, quote, if a person has regularly drunk fine wine with dinner, he regrets the lack of a fine wine at tonight's dinner more than someone who has never had a fine wine with dinner. Basically, this quote is saying that if you already have had something and then suddenly have a deficiency of that thing, that you are going to miss what you have had in the past, right? I think this can relate to death in some way, because after all of the good that you had in life and suddenly you're deprived of it, makes sense that you would miss the good things you had. Except that opens you up, as they point out, to the objection that you won't mind the deprivation because you won't exist. So you really can't use that as a differentiator between prenatal and posthumous non-existence, because even though in death you will be deprived of the kind of goods you had in life, you won't mind being deprived of them. Right? That's always the kicker. Is that the kind of goods that death deprives us of are similar to the goods that we know now. But that deprivation of those goods, those known goods, will not cause us any distress because we won't mind it because we won't exist. So you really can't use that objection or that point as a way of differentiating the two kinds of non-existence. But prenatal non-existence is a deprivation of past experienced goods, goods to which we are indifferent. Death deprives us of something we care about, whereas prenatal non-existence deprives us of something to which we are indifferent. Well, I mean, I just quoted that because that's an incredibly important point. That is their solution. Their proposed solution is that, at least from our vantage point of life, our fear of death or our thinking that death is a bad thing is justified because we regard the goods that we will be deprived of in the future as being meaningful to us because they're in the future, whereas we're indifferent to the goods that we were deprived of by prenatal non-existence because those are past goods. It opens up all kinds of questions, but I think that's essentially the idea. Because of our desire to keep our bads in the past and our goods in the future, I just want to reinforce that that's correct. The only way to solve this asymmetrical issue would be for us to focus on caring about future goods more than past goods. That's right. That we do care more about such goods, future goods than past goods is their major point at the end. Thus making it fully rational that we would care more about the deprivations of future goods by the hand of death than how prenatal non-existence deprives past goods, thereby making death a bad thing. Yeah, I think it's more or less, it's a pretty good account of Bricker and Fisher's proposed solution to the asymmetry problem.